Hi guys, welcome to this video. This video is going to be a bit different from the sorts of content that I normally make. It is taken nearly verbatim for an article that I wrote for my new website that I'm launching in a few weeks. Now normally I wouldn't put out a video for the new website until the website is launched, but recent events have kind of pushed the schedule forward a little bit. So this video is going to be a bit, not quite, of a taste of the kind of more research focused content that'll be on my new website, although obviously, again, this isn't entirely the case because current events have changed the trajectory a little bit. The article is not live yet because the website is not live yet, but I will still link to it in the description so that when it is live, you can follow that link. And once it's up and running, I will also link to the new website as well as ways you can support it if you so choose in the description below. So anyway, let's get started. If the title didn't already tell you, this is going to need a massive content warning for gun violence, sexual violence, and PTSD. Now this is gun violence directed both towards others and towards the self, so that is your fair warning. On the 12th of August 2021, 6 people were shot and killed in Plymouth, UK, including the gunman, of his mother, and a 3-year-old girl. It was the UK's first mass shooting since 2010 and only its second since its 1997 Firearms Act, which was put in place in response to a 1996 school shooting. For many, this was a surprise because mass shootings just don't happen here, right? To make matters worse, it was reported shortly after that the gunman was a Trump-supporting, QAnon-spouting, self-described member of the Incel community. More on that later. This was a pretty huge deal. It meant that thanks to online spaces, ideologies that have led to acts of violence in the US have now led to death in the UK. It meant that the culture of gun-toting misogyny in the US was spreading, and all of this 2 miles from my house. So I wanted to make this video today to kind of lay out what I, as a dual US-UK citizen, saw in the shooting and its aftermath. It's not sexual assault trauma, so it's a bit of a different space for me, but it's led to me realizing something interesting about the way we think about trauma. I grew up in the culture of looking over my shoulder for guns, of every day seeing the news of more people dead from various shootings. And I also grew up in an environment of perceived safety across the pond. When I came here, I was supposed to be safe from all of this, but it still happened. So now that I've had a couple of days to sort of process what happened, and I've spoken to my counselor, I wanted to lay out my thoughts. Partially because I think it'll be cathartic for me to kind of like let this anger out, but also because I think it's important to understand the wider context of all of this. If I'm honest, my first thought was probably the same as everybody else's. I was heartbroken, scared, confused. How could this happen here? How did he get a gun? I grieved for the families, talked to everybody I knew about how strange it was, and I looked up how close it was to my house. And then I got angry. How dare he, How dare he hurt these people? Who gave him the right to be judge, jury, and executioner on 5 innocent lives? The fury, it's overwhelming. And then some of the more interesting thoughts came up. How is this allowed to happen? What happened to me being safe here? Why can't I escape this? So, look, I know how it sounds. I know how selfish that sounds. I acknowledge that. But this is the sort of thing that led me into writing this script today, because these unconscious thoughts led me to realizing how growing up in the environment I did was traumatizing in its own way. One of the things that has become a pattern for me as these events, whether they be mass shootings or crimes against women, keep happening, is that I start to become angry at how other people are reacting. Now, I don't know what that says about me, but it's a pattern anyway. There seemed to be some flippancy about the way people were responding. It wasn't that they didn't care, it wasn't that they didn't think it was tragic, they did, but it's hard for me to put my finger on, what bothered me. But I think it comes down to this idea of how unfair it is that this gets to be a one-off event for some people. I see these events as part of a pattern. But because of the rarity of these events here, because of the lack of guns in this country, others see it as a simple tragedy. Now, it is a tragedy, but it's far from simple. So there are two major reactions from people that I want to point out here. First is my friends. She grew up in places where gun violence is just not a thing. Southwest UK and New Zealand. Obviously, things like Christchurch notwithstanding. When we went to see the Suicide Squad, the night after the shooting, she tells me that she's not really afraid. The thing is, she says, this isn't something I have to deal with. It's sad, but it's not like I'm afraid it's gonna happen again. She describes her interactions with her housemates as following the same sentiment. And it's not that she's wrong for thinking this way, because she's not. She has absolutely no frame of reference for this to be anything other than a sad occurrence that eventually we, as a nation, will forge on from together. Neither do her housemates. But for me, these things just feel never ending. It feels like gun violence is following me. It didn't just happen in the UK, it happened where I lived. The closest thing I had been to something like this before was the Kalamazoo Uber murders in 2016, and even that was 45 minutes to an hour away from my house. This is in my backyard. That was really affecting. It felt like there was no escape. I'm not gonna lie to you, Kalamazoo Uber murders is not an easy thing to get your lips around. Anyway, the other reaction is from someone I know on Instagram. We're chill and friendly, but we don't really know each other that well. Context. Following a rant I posted on Instagram, which I will quote entirely later on in this video, he messaged me about the headline I was responding to. Again, I'll post that when I read the quote. So I'm not going to quote him directly, especially since my anger at the time was misdirected, but I'll give you the gist of the conversation here. I mentioned the culture that bred people like the Plymouth gunman, which, by the way, his identity is well known, but I'm not going to name him here. Okay, and how something needs to be done about it. He tells me that since this is the internet and largely anonymous boards like Reddit and 4chan, that there's not much that could really be done. You can't kill an idea. Well, that set me off. So again, this anger was misdirected. I misunderstood his words to mean that since we can't prevent people from being dicks on the internet, that means there's not much we can do. In reality, he was mourning the state of the world. I was just hopped up on rage-fueled adrenaline and misinterpreted his words. But it wasn't an unreasonable misunderstanding. I've heard a lot of arguments from people, usually but not exclusively on the gun debate, that since it's going to happen anyway, what's the point in trying to regulate anything? Even if this wasn't what he was saying, it wasn't, I was primed to think that it was, because I've heard this before. In this case, it was not about the guns of it all. The UK has pretty strict licensing rules. Instead, I was angry about the ideas of how we treat violence against women. Now, obviously, this is my wheelhouse. I'm gonna link like a crap load of articles in the description for you to peruse if you so desire. But essentially, the prevalence of guns and gun violence against women are inextricably linked. Gun presence increases the death of women by a factor of 500. That's insane, right? Like, the fact that people might be brushing aside these links because the internet is a hellscape is just infuriating to me. Now, I want to stress that I actually haven't seen this argument in person, but I'm not exactly seeking out the sorts of people who would make it. But the fact that it came up as a possibility was more than enough for me because, like I said, I've seen this line of argument before. So, you know me, I love me my story times, my anecdotes. So here's the one thing that made me realize that this is something of a pattern for me when it comes to my reaction to other people's reactions to gun violence. So in 2018, I was on the tube on my way to uni. It was the day after Valentine's Day, the day after 17 students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, were killed in a tragic shooting. The attack became famous for its survivors being outspoken activists for change, but at the time, everyone was still recovering. The Metro UK, which for those of you who don't know is a newspaper given for free to passengers on the underground, had the shooting on the front page. And I remember watching people across from me, one by one, flip pages as I rode into the city, moving on. They scanned their eyes over these horrific words and then turned the page. That was infuriating to me. How could they not be more angry? How could they not see it as a bigger deal? Could they not see how much pain this caused? And like, of course they did. they knew. It's not like people in the US look at bad news from other countries as anything more than distant tragedies. They're horrific, but there's not something I can do about it from here right this second. It's not like I can protest for them, right? But for me, all I saw was the injustice. The fact that some people got to just move on with their lives, while other people were scarred forever. So I felt that way after the aftermath of the Plymouth shooting. When my friend told me that it's not something that she has to actively worry about, even though she's right and it's probably healthy for her not to dwell on the what ifs, I wanted to scream. How dare people not think this is earth-shattering? How selfish could they be? But that's not fair of me to think. They're not selfish, they're right. But I realized that it reminded me of the sorts of things that infuriated me about the news coverage. So, welcome to the headline that pissed me off, like, royally. I wanted this to be a big deal because I saw this as part of a pattern of violence. If we don't address this pattern, how on earth are we going to protect people? So I'm a pretty political person, but I usually just rant to my friends or my mom or scream random shit while they just smile and nod. But there was one headline that I could not respond to. This is the Telegraph's doozy. Mass shooting is Plymouth's 9/11. Residents leader tells Priti Patel, it's our home secretary. Now the article is behind a paywall. I couldn't read it in its entirety, so I don't know the context of this comment. But this was a headline. This is what people are going to see to make them want to read the article. And yeah, basically all headlines are clickbait, but this, and I went off on Instagram. So here's the full rant. What is this shit? No. This might be a big deal here, but to me this is normal. This is not a once in a lifetime thing. This is a culmination of a long time problem. This asshole spent his time complaining about how he couldn't get laid, so in response he killed people, including a 3-year-old child. People love to talk about how this is a one-off because of the gun violence element, but this is at least the third country that has seen these killer virgin cases. You don't get to pretend that this is some major shock because you don't have a lot of guns. The culture that has created this shit has been brewing for years. Elliot Rodger was never going to be the first and last, and the only people this would be a shock to are those who have either just woken up after 10 years or those who have been purposefully sticking their heads in the goddamn sand. Plymouth is not the victim here. The UK is not the victim here. The victims here died for some dipshit's pride. They're the ones we should be thinking about. Do not come at me with this bullshit. I will apparently not take it well. Have a nice night. So what pissed me off the most about this headline is that in comparing this to 9/11, even if in context this wasn't what the comment was saying, the headline implied that this event was some shocking, unprecedented thing. It isn't. I talk about the other killer virgin cases later, but the fact is that this is nothing of the sort. This is just another incident in a line of incidents, and it isn't over. It won't be. Not until we nip this shit in the bud. So dismissing this as a one-off tragedy, in this case, by not making a bigger deal out of it, we might be putting women in danger. Maybe not in Plymouth or the UK, but somewhere else, some dipshit will try this again. We cannot treat this as a singular event. We have to treat this as a pattern that it is. Otherwise, we are being willfully ignorant and people are going to die. So I think it might be worth discussing the environment that kind of bred this thinking, and I'm going to start with the gun violence angle. Fun! It's no secret to most of the world that there is an epidemic in the US involving gun violence. According to the BBC, 73% of American homicides are committed using guns, and ownership is associated with a drastic risk of people taking their own life. So this isn't something I need to go on too much detail in because everyone kind of knows about it. But the fact is that the United States has a problem regarding conversations surrounding gun violence. One article, which I have linked in the description, talks about the problems in the current system of gun ownership in the US and how it leads to shootings. I am not going to debate that here. I've made my views on guns clear in the past, and I don't really see a need to make a whole thing about it right now. It's just important to mention that when growing up in the United States, I needed to learn how to be hypervigilant. Now, I grew up with a debilitating fear of guns. This is separate from all of this. I once had to be removed from a first grade movie day on the police because I was so distraught seeing the guns on screen, like they had to physically remove me. I've actually traced this fear to 9/11. I know that sounds really weird, but I think because I was trying to filter all of this death through my 6-year-old brain, I'm going 9/11 death, guns death, 9/11 guns. You know what I mean? I think that's where that came from, but anyway. I'm saying this not because I think I have some greater fear than others, just that I came into this whole hypervigilance thing already on guard because of this childhood phobia. So, having said all of this, being American, a fear of gun violence is ever present. My friends in college who grew up in New York and Boston, they described a game that they used to play with their friends called Gun or Firecracker. Well, that didn't really resonate with me because I grew up in suburbia. I had done the same thing. Every time you hear a pop go off, you go, that's a firecracker, right? Right? And to my knowledge, it always was. No, there was that one time that there was a car accident. But that's an outlier, that was weird. Everyone was fine. Don't worry. To my friends in the UK, this fear has always been a little bit funny. And it is, I suppose, you know, to see someone flinch every time a car backfires. There's next to no chance it will be a gun. You're supposed to be safe here, right? So what's the problem? The problem is that when you grow up with that threat ever present, it doesn't leave the minute you do, and you're supposed to be safe. Instead, you start to question your own sanity. Why am I still afraid? I'm not in any danger. Am I just being ridiculous? You don't think of yourself as being traumatized, especially when you've never been in an active shooter situation, as I haven't. But the danger remains. I still looked over my shoulder every day in high school and college looking for signs of a potential shooter. I avoided the most crowded areas of campus and knew in every single classroom where the prime place for me to hide would be. Active shooter drills were a massive part of my schooling, and I grew up reading horror stories seemingly every other week. My high school got threats once while my brother was still in school, to the point where some students refused to show up that day. It's a nightmare, but we think it's normal, and like, how fucked up is that actually, like, when you think about it? It's not great. So this here is my full disclosure. I have never been involved in an active shooter situation, and thankfully I don't know anybody who has. But I have experienced the fear and dread that comes along with that. This is the story of the terrorist attack when I was in college. Fun, right? November 28th, 2016 was a Friday. I only had one class that morning, Medieval England, which was with my favorite professor, which was in the basement of one of the buildings. I was recovering from mono at the time, and I'd used up all my absences, so I still had to actually go to class, but I was like completely zoned out and I was not paying any attention. My professor was super cool about it. Like, as long as I was there, she'd like count my participation grade, and then she gave me a decent extension on the final assignment. She's the best, and I still talk to her, but I digress. So my professor stops in the middle of her lesson, according to one article, at 9:52 a.m. and kind of confusedly looks over at the computer screen, and she shakes it off, keeps going, but then she does it again and again. And finally she says, sorry guys, I'm just getting this weird notice on my computer monitor. And it said something about how we needed to go into lockdown and had flashing danger lights. And she says, you know, it's probably just a test, but I don't remember anything being scheduled today. So anyway, and she keeps going with her lesson, but she keeps pausing periodically to look over at the computer screen. We were, all a bit confused, and I was definitely out of it, but even I could see she was uncomfortable. And finally she asks us if we could just check social media just in case. Now, she didn't allow technology of any kind in her classroom, so this is kind of a big thing. And that's when someone said they saw it. Active shooter situation in progress. Begin, run, hide, fight protocols. So immediately we spring into action. We've done it before our entire lives, and there was luckily only one window, the one on the door. So we all pressed ourselves up against the walls, shut off the lights, and hid. So I chose my spot very specifically. It was on the same wall as the door, but not in the corner, so there wasn't an easy way for him to reach me if he came through the door. I had a decent shot of getting out. And then students who had been in the military grabbed chairs and stationed themselves by the door ready to attack him if he came through. And the rest of us crouched on the ground, obsessively checking Twitter, texting our loved ones, and every once in a while someone would whisper update us from their phone. There was at least one casualty, and we were like, fuck. We sat like that in the dark for several hours. I only remember texting, like the terror, texting my mom, my friend, looking for news from the outside that I couldn't see from my position, on the collection floor. And a sneeze. At one point, we were told one suspect was dead, but that there was at least one other, and he had not yet been apprehended. They traced him to a parking garage on the northeast side of campus. I was on the northeast side of campus. My car wasn't, it was in a different garage by the Union, but I was still near enough to the action that it made my blood run cold. What if he came in here? What would I do then? I was a wreck, I was panicking, crying, the works. It was fun. It was a fun time. I had fun. After a while, they finally let us go. We learned that there was no active shooter, that the shots that were fired actually came from the police, and that the whole thing was over in a couple minutes. What had actually happened was that an 18-year-old student had run his van into a crowd of students on their way to class and then jumped out brandishing a knife at them. 13 students were injured, but none of the injuries were life-threatening. The only death was that of the suspect. The rest of it was that they just weren't sure if he'd been working alone. Even still, for several hours, it was like my worst nightmare had come true. I wanted to include this story so that there is at least some full disclosure here for my investment in these cases. I've been in that position before, and while I count myself extremely lucky that no one was seriously injured that day, I definitely felt like all of the paranoia that I had felt for years was justified. And while the Guardian article linked in the description claims that the following Monday classes were canceled, I don't remember that. What I remember is that once it was over, the university claimed it was safe and told us we could go back to classes for the afternoon. So they did. And that was the loss of the news that I heard, at least. My professor sent us home and told us under no circumstances were we to go to classes in the afternoon. And I didn't actually have any classes in the afternoon anyway, so I just went to Tim Hortons and curled up on my bed for the rest of the day. Yay. So it felt like the reaction from the university not to cancel classes was endemic of the fact that this sort of thing had become so normalized that it wasn't even worth talking about. The number of news stories I could find while writing this article and the Wikipedia article that I found a couple years back always surprises me. I don't remember it being that big of a deal at the time. I mean, no innocent people died, and the van and knife attacks in London, Berlin, Stockholm, Barcelona, Manhattan, they hadn't happened yet. We knew about the van and knife attacks because Nice had been attacked a couple months prior, but it wasn't this big dangerous thing that it became in 2017. It felt like it was being ignored by the media. So clearly there's precedent for me to be frustrated with that. So that's the gun violence angle of all of this. But what about the other side? The continued and real present danger to women. Let's talk about incels, shall we? Do we have to? Oh my god. Alright, so what is an incel? What is going on with all of this? Why do we keep talking about it? So incel, which is short for involuntary celibate, describes a mindset of men on the internet who believe that they are being denied sexual activity despite wanting to participate. The mindset usually involves the use of terms specific to that community, such as black pill, which is a vague matrix reference that describes descending into this incel ideology. The community was made famous after Elliot Rodger's 2014 rampage at UC Santa Barbara that killed 7 people. But it's not gone away. In the online communities Rodger frequented, he's become a hero. I've linked some of the tamest things I can find in some news stories, but honestly, read at your own risk. It isn't necessarily that he's idolized for the murdered, though I mean, sometimes. Instead, incels see him as saying what they've always been afraid to say. They see him as someone who exposed the problems of the world, and in some cases is like a martyr for the cause. Again, I mostly linked news articles below, and you can see some of this in the Reddit comments, but if you really want to get to these discussions, I'll leave you to seek them out on your own. So it's not necessarily a new thing for murderers to become heroes. It's always been weird, but if you, like me, are interested in true crime, you know it's not exactly a novel phenomenon. The problem here is the method of attack. These are spree killers, not serial killers, which means that they can kill as many people as they want in the span of 6 minutes, and that's how long the Plymouth shooting took. And the ubiquity of the rhetoric. Elliot Rodger's manifesto is freely available online. I will not link it though. I refuse to give those ideas a platform. If you're interested though, the YouTube videos that I linked in the description that discuss Rodger's case do talk about the manifesto, but also talk about why it's so fucked up, so watch those instead. When people like Rodger become idolized, we get copycats. With Plymouth, this is now at least the third country where these problems have arisen. In the US and California, in Toronto, a van described as a domestic terror attack, and now down the road from where I used to work. Not to mention some smaller incidents linked to the community, like there's other stuff too. After Elliot Rodger's spree, everyone was talking about it, but there was no mention of the fact that the community was rampant, that these things could escalate, and it did, again and again and again. So this is a lot of rage, a lot of statistics, and a lot of violence. What's the point in putting this out there? You know, what the point is that in experiencing all of this, I realized something. Simply being in an environment where gun violence is normalized and killers run rampant, I've developed a trauma reaction to events like this. I don't feel flashbacks to the incident in college when I think about the Plymouth attack, but my heart was still racing the way it does every time I read about a new shooting in the news. And I don't expect to be shot on the street, but I still jump out of my skin every time I hear a car backfiring. And like most women, I still feel the need to soften my rejections in order to avoid a violent response from men. I don't know what I would call this phenomenon. At first I was thinking I would call it environmental trauma, but then I Googled that and it turns out that it's like a term for like the environmental factors that like affect our development, and that's not really what this is. I mean, it is, but it's more than that, like separate, different, I guess. So I found this article from Very Well Mind, and it's the closest thing I found to what I'm talking about. It's about collective trauma. With things like the COVID-19 pandemic, this idea of collective trauma is something that's been at the forefront of the psychiatric community. But this is the quote that resonated with me. People don't necessarily need to have experienced the event firsthand to be changed by it. Watching the events unfold on the news can be traumatic, for example. And that's what this is, right? Being bombarded with the news of all of this death and hurt and violence led me to be more significantly affected by this shooting than other people I know. It's not that I'm scared, I know I'm safe. I'm angry, furious, really. And when I'm faced with the reactions that I've seen, it's just been painful to me. It's overwhelming, and I don't know what to do. So I spoke to my counselor yesterday at the time of this recording, how I feel bad for my reactions to this, towards other people, and obviously we talked through it, but we really looked at how to recognize the effects of that slow building trauma. How just because I wasn't directly involved doesn't mean the tragedy doesn't still have an effect. And I think this is something really worth considering when exploring our own self-care. I think we might feel guilt or shame or to trauma responses that have nothing to do with the events that like led to our PTSD diagnosis, but everyone is shaped by trauma. If we think back to the fear of guns from 9/11 example that I mentioned earlier, I mean, why wouldn't I be affected by that? I was 6, 3,000 people died, everyone around me was crying. Everything changed that day. Are you gonna tell a 6-year-old that she can't be scared because she wasn't in New York City at the time? Of course not, that's ridiculous. So why, when something like this happens, don't we treat ourselves the same way? Mass shootings, violence against women, and internet male entitlement is traumatizing. Constantly being exposed to that kind of fear, being bombarded with it, is traumatizing. We shouldn't pretend that it isn't, because in order to do something to help, we have to acknowledge it. We need to identify the problem so that we can work towards solving it. Obviously, our pain won't compare to that of the victims. I'm not trying to make that argument. Instead, I think we need to allow ourselves the pain that we do feel. I think, like, for me, permission is a big thing when it comes to self-care, allowing myself to feel things, and this is a prime example. We need to let ourselves acknowledge the pain, otherwise nothing will get better. So I really want to write like a proper article on this, like research the effects and what it means for, you know, our society and, you know, culture. And my theory is that, you know, this is caused by how the internet has changed things, you know, how we view the news. It's constant, you know, instead of like watching the news for like an hour at 6 o'clock while your parents are cooking dinner or whatever, this is constant. We get push notification. It casts a wider net. So we get turned off to the tragedy after a while just to cope. But I think it also gives up an opportunity if we want to use it. We wouldn't have known about a lot of the problems in the world before the internet. Now we do. So I might have brushed it off. I might have brushed it off too if it weren't for the experiences that shaped me. And so people like me can identify a pattern when it arises. So we should use our experiences, this collective trauma, and funnel it into something productive. Will we be able to fix it? No. Will it be a form of therapy? I don't know. Maybe. But I feel like we have to try. Thank you so much for watching that really, really weird, really depressing video. I kind of tried to have some energy, but there's not much you can really do with a topic this rough. Once again, this is an accidental preview of a new website that I will be launching, which is surrounding a research project I'm conducting. When it is launched, I will make a proper announcement for it and all the links and stuff if you want to support it or be involved somehow, or all that kind of stuff will be in the description once it's launched, which will probably be, if not the beginning or middle, then the end of September. So if you're interested, check back for that, but I will put a proper announcement when it is. My social media will be in the description. The blog that I rarely update but that is live will also be linked in case you want to read some old articles. And I will see you soon. If you're wondering where I've been, it's been working on this. It's been working on this project. So yeah. So thanks again. I'll see you next time. Have a wonderful week.